Hey everyone, I want to thank you once again for tuning in for the Year in Red video, the year-long study of the parables of Jesus and some of the teachings of Jesus. It's the last one, so I wanted to do something a little bit different, so I sort of went on location. I wanted to, in speaking for Grace and Andy and Jesse and myself, I wanted to thank you so much for tuning in. For those of you that have watched the videos, if you haven't, they're all on our YouTube channel, so be sure and check those out. And if you have any questions or if you have any comments, please let us know. Wanted to do something a little bit different and focus a little bit different of a sort of a parable or teaching of Jesus on this last one. So I don't waste too much time because I'm going to read a little portion of it. I would like to go ahead and get into it, sort of set a little backdrop of what's taking place. It's after the resurrection of Jesus, and the disciples have been up on and sort of locked themselves in an upper room because they're a little fearful of the religious leaders of the day, of any persecution. They've just crucified Jesus, so the disciples are a little bit, skittish about trying to go out and just proclaim the word of Jesus. And so Jesus has appeared to them there, and then what takes place in John chapter 21 is something's very interesting. A little more backdrop is that we all know that the disciples, a lot of them came from a fishing background. They've spent their time fishing. That's how they made their living. Their families had done it. However, once they left their nets in the beginning of the Gospels, they leave their nets and start following Jesus. None of them really go back to fishing. We're actually only told of Peter, who goes back and fishes later. Whenever the temple tax needed to be paid, Jesus tells him to go out and catch a fish, and in the fish's mouth he will find the money for the temple tax. So that's really the disciple that we're told about that goes fishing up until John chapter 21. A very interesting thing takes place. As I said, it's after the resurrection. Jesus had left. They'd crucified Jesus, and the disciples were a little afraid. And all of a sudden in John chapter 21, I'm going to go ahead and read this to you, but Peter says something very interesting. It says, after this, Jesus appeared again to his disciples by the Sea of Galilee, and it happened this way. Simon Peter, Thomas, Nathanael, the sons of Zebedee, and two other disciples were together. Simon says, I'm going out to fish, he told them. And they said, well, we're going with you. So they went out and they got into a boat, but that night they caught nothing. Early in the morning, Jesus stood on the shore, but the disciples did not realize that it was Jesus. And he called to them, friends, haven't you any fish? And they answered, no. And he said, throw your nets on the right side of the boat, and you will find some. When they did, they were unable to haul in the net because of the large number of fish. I want to stop there a little bit, because here's what happens. Whenever I read this whole passage, just that point, I believe that in hearing a lot of things that take place from youth groups and students and other adults and things that are taking place throughout, that I've heard emails and things, what takes place is very nice for groups to come to camp, and you spend time with a bunch of other Christians, and you feel like the presence of Jesus is always there with you. But then all of a sudden we go back and we feel alone, and we feel that Jesus isn't there. We don't have that same feeling. And so what we decide to do is, hey, it's best for us to go back to our old way of life because that was comfortable. And whenever I look at this passage, that's exactly what I feel that that Peter did. Peter had actually been with Jesus all these 3 years, and he had walked with Jesus, and he had seen the miracles. He had performed some great things. He had been on the Mount of Transfiguration, but all of a sudden Jesus wasn't there. And Peter makes a weird decision, and that is that I'm going back to my old way of life. Whenever he goes back to that old way of life, whenever he goes back to fishing, goes back to those things that made him money, that was profitable in the past, we all also should recognize that in those early verses of John 21, what takes place is his friends go with him. That Peter was a leader and his friends went with him. And so later on we actually find out Jesus is there on the shore, and what Jesus does is he builds a fire and he cooks breakfast for him and he feeds them there on the shore. And then afterwards he asks Peter to go for a walk. And he and Peter are walking along the beach, and they're walking along, and then Jesus asked Peter these questions, and it's actually found in verse 15, and it says, when they had finished eating, Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? And he said, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. And Jesus said, then feed my sheep. Again, Jesus said, Simon, son of John, do you love me? And he answered, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. And he said, take care of my sheep. The third time he said to him, Simon, son of John, do you love me? And then what happens is, this is very interesting. It says Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him the third time, do you love me? And he said, yes, Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you. It's very interesting what takes place there, because there's many translations you can look at the different words that are used there, but the one that really comes back to me is, if I try to read this, or how it affects me, is this. Jesus looks at Peter and says, Peter, if you love me, what are you doing here? What are you doing on the shore? What are you doing there? Why'd you come back to this? I've called you for something better. And so my challenge for you guys, at the end of the year, it's a new year. Some of you guys want to make some New Year's resolutions, a whole bunch of other things. But my challenge comes back to this. Many of you guys, many of us, me, myself included, all of a sudden we feel that God isn't working in our life, and it's very easy for us to go back to the way of life that we loved and we cared about before, those profitable things before. But we should recognize there was no fish caught. It wasn't profitable. It wasn't rewarding. And Jesus shows up right where they are and says, what are you doing here? Peter, why are you here? I've called you for something better than this. Many of you guys come to camp. Many of you guys go to work. You go to church on Sunday, to youth group, and then what ends up happening is you go back into the world that's comfortable, and very easily you become back to what you were before Jesus was in your life. Many words can be used for it, backsliding and all that other stuff, but at the end of the day, I know this, based on that Bible passage, this is what I'm told. This is the way I feel. Jesus shows up where Peter was, where you are, where I am. He says, what are you doing here? If you love me, why are you here? Hey, my challenge for you guys is this. I would have you look at it. I've had you think about it. You determine, why are you there? We love you. We appreciate you guys a lot. Thanks for tuning in. We'll be praying for you. Thanks a lot. Talk to you later.